Good afternoon and welcome, everyone. See, you're all streaming in, literally. Welcome. Good. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for our regular Coffee with Conflict Dynamics session. And what we try to do in these sessions is address something really topical, which you can get a whole lot of information from a specialist on. So today's specialist is Angela du Plessis. Angela is one of the conflict dynamics mediators and also facilitators and trainers. And Angela is extremely well positioned to address this issue of dealing with mental health issues in the workplace. This is something that seems to be increasing, or maybe we're just much more aware of it. I'm sure Angela will give us some feedback on that, but it is an extremely important topic, and how we deal with it as employers and is really critical, and I guess reflects on the employer, but also really assists the employee who's having to deal with mental health issues. A little bit of background about Angela and why she's so well suited for this topic. Angela is a trained social worker. She actually qualified as a social worker in 1977, practiced, went on to do her master's at Oxford in social work, and eventually got her doctorate in social work in 1995. And at that point, she took her career in a bit of a shift, and she moved towards corporate, where she specialized in employee relations and organizational development. So the combination of having a social work background and employee relations and a dispute resolution and an organizational development background is just, I can't imagine there are very many people in the world that have that perfect confluence of skill and experience to be able to deal with this topic. The other aspect that I think should be mentioned up front before I hand over to Angela is that she has dealt with many of these cases. You know, as a senior commissioner at the CCMA, she literally mediated and arbitrated thousands of cases, some of which would even have involved this, but more recently she's had a particular interest in this topic, as well as another topic which you may have heard her speak about before, and that is sexual harassment disputes. But I think you'll all agree with me that Angela's unbelievably well qualified to be with us this afternoon, and I'm sure we're all going to learn a lot from Angela. The format is really having coffee with Angela this afternoon. So if you have any questions, please just pop them into the chat. I'll keep an eye on the chat and make sure that your questions are raised in the conversation. And Angela will be taking us through her presentation, but isn't at all fussed about being interrupted and maybe segueing into a few topics which you've put up in the chat. But also she'll direct us in terms of whether that subject matter will be dealt with later. So we look forward to a really informative and engaged hour with Angela this afternoon. Thank you, Angela.
Thanks, Marion. Gosh, after that introduction, I hope I don't make any mistakes at all, especially on the technical side. So thank you for that very kind and warm introduction. It's my pleasure to be here, and it's actually been a great pleasure to prepare this topic because it is something that I am very passionate about and really have done a lot of work over the years. So I'm going to take you through my slides. So just to take you quickly through an overview, I'm going to look at some caveats. I'm going to then move on to, I don't know why this thing did, okay, sorry, some caveats, some common conditions and issues, look at some conundrums, and I'm sure that that's where our audience would like to come in as well. What are some of the difficulties and almost insoluble issues that employers and employees face on this journey? Then talk specifically about addictions, because I want to take what I've called a broader view of what can be considered addictions, and then just a couple of words around how one can get one's hands tighter around these particular issues, and just a couple of suggestions. So if we start with my caveats, and I think the first caveat that I must say is that I did prepare this as a fireside chat. And once I got into doing some of the research, I just realized that to go into some of the case law, and I think a lot of people here will be very familiar with the three or four big cases that kind of changed some of the thinking, would just complicate it. And there's so much to say on mental health that I made a decision not to include case law, and I thought that somebody else wouldn't maybe like to take that on going forward. I'm not doing a detailed presentation of mental health conditions per se, because, talking about differential diagnoses, what is the difference between reactive depression and endogenous, and, those sorts of things. But I really wanted to focus on talking a lot about everyday pervasive issues that people in ER, HR, CCMA, etc. would come upon, as opposed to really, really complicated and very detailed and difficult diagnostic issues. So the next thing that I'd like to say is that we're going to focus on, as I said before, the conundrums faced by employers and employees in navigating very challenging challenges associated with these particular issues. And then just to make the point that the journey that I've been on has been since 1980, when I entered as the social worker, the only social worker in Arrangement for De Beers, which in those mines, in those days, CDM was the richest diamond mine in the world, gem diamond mine in the world. And it was a fascinating place to be, and people were puzzled. What is a mental health practitioner looking for here? What are you doing? And in fact, our point of entry in those very early days was often through addictions and alcohol policies, because there was a lot of research coming out, and Sanka played a huge role here. A lot of research coming out in how much alcoholism and drug addiction were costing employees, but it was a kind of a hidden cost. So that became the basis of a broader based employee assistance program, which HIV/AIDS in the 80s and 90s played a huge role in sensitizing employers to both the psychological and physical aspects of ill health, and then to a broader mental health focus. And now we don't talk about assistance programs, but wellness programs. And of course, all of us know that it had antecedents before, but definitely exacerbated by COVID. The focus on mental health as a workplace issue has come more and more to the fore. So what am I talking about largely when I'm talking about these mental health issues? Okay. Um, First of all, I think the most pervasive is anxiety and or depression. They often go together. And this is triggered by stress, but I've changed that to the concept of distress, because people, when we know that there's eurest, stress and distress, and there's lots to worry about these days across a whole range of issues. Other things that have come up are obviously addiction, which I'm going to go into a little bit later on, but also some aspects of obsessive compulsive disorders and some eating disorders, anorexia, bulimia, that kind of stuff. But definitely what I think we're seeing most of, I think 1 in 4 people are going to suffer mental health issues, and about 75% of them are never going to get treatment or assistance. at a more psychological level, and I'm going to talk about that really as an issue a little bit later on under addictions, is abandonment as a theme in causing mental health issues that are triggered by one's early life and attachment to parental figures, etc. And also what I've seen is if you look at a lot of people that are suffering from mental health issues in the workplace, very often what's happened is something, and unfortunately it's something like discrimination, bullying, harassment, etc., that has taken very nothing to do with intelligence, very intelligent people, competent people, and given them an experience, and we'll talk a bit more about this going forward, that really has taken them from very competent, confident people and just destroyed them emotionally and psychologically. And yeah, I'm sure that a lot of you will know exactly what I mean here. And another theme that I find in mental health issues, that I find or discover in the workplace, is we know about flight, fight, freeze, and fawn. And what I found that when it comes to some of the workplace issues, such as bullying and harassment, that freezing is the emotional state that a person goes to, and that plays a role. They literally remain frozen, horrified at what's been suggested or what's been happened to them or a particular experience. And as I said, this leads to both the silencing, but also what I call the horrible, cunning trick of a harasser or bully is that the first thought that the victim will have usually is not only the frozen one, but also, did I do something that might have provoked this in any way? So, and then the other theme, which I've noticed in a lot of cases that I've done, and these are very often discrimination based on race and gender, is that people feel trapped and helpless, but they feel disempowered to do anything. They're desperate for their job. They might be the only breadwinner for many people in families, etc., etc., and they are resigned. So they're able to function, but they're just not functioning at their optimum at all. And they are resigned to feeling marginalized, experiences of being excluded and unwelcome in the workplace. So this is just a sort of overview of some of the things, as opposed to some of the more dramatic things. That these are some of the common things which we find, or I certainly find in the work that I do. So I also thought about the issue of how do mental health issues present in the workplace? And there are a number of ways in which they can present in the workplace. Okay, so they can obviously come up as an incapacity in the form of an illness. For example, a person having a total depressive shutdown, may be hospitalized, may in fact recover and return to work, but may in fact be placed on some sort of disability grant going forward, or disability some kind of grant to mean that they don't have to return to work. And then the second way, which I think we see a lot of it, can be in incapacity in terms of poor work performance. And here there are a myriad of reasons for why mental health issues might interfere with one's ability to work well. And this could be some aspect about incompatibility, it could be mourning, it could be grief, it could be loss, it could be the loss of a loved one, it could be a divorce, concentration problems, people just feeling overwhelmed by feelings of loss and sadness. this kind of thing. So we often, and that's when we would not go the disciplinary route, but rather go the problem-solving route. Then it could come up in terms of a disability, in terms of the Employment Equity Act. And here I'm thinking of certain neurodiversity issues such as ADHD, autism, OCD, Tourette syndrome. And as a colleague said in a webinar we did a couple of years ago, the old view of many of these neurodiversity issues was that the person was demonized as opposed to assisted. And I think society's gone through a whole shift in terms of thinking about neurodiversity as simply another form of diversity. The next one that I thought of was incompatibility, and as we know, that is the third form of incapacity. And the reason for the disharmony, so either not getting on in terms of the culture of an organization or a relationship issue that really does affect the performance often of a team, could be related to a mental health issue that's being displayed, or the impact of a hostile environment where a person's made to feel marginalized, unwelcome, microaggression, that kind of thing I was thinking about there. The other way that I've seen it, and it doesn't often crop up like this, but I think it can. And I just wanted to tell you the story of a case that I got involved with some years ago around a false allegation of sexual harassment. So this was a relatively senior woman in what we would consider quite a man's world. And she made many false allegations about her male boss, who was a kind of regional character, or regional role. She was at a plant level, head of a plant. And she really made very serious allegations and really made everybody's life very difficult. And they got the senior HR person from their head office to go down and to do an investigation, and it was found out that her claims were false, and indeed she was guilty of sexual harassment. But they were so disconcerted by this whole thing that they did ask an outsider, that was myself, to go down and do another investigation. And I confirmed exactly what had been said. But this was a smallish number of operations at the coast, on the east coast somewhere. And the people were very close to each other. A lot of people had married into other workers' families. There were a lot of relationships, friendship groups. And the false allegations of the senior woman really, really had created a very toxic and hostile work environment. And I just made a note of what the CEO said when I went and I visited him. He said, you know, she absolutely broke the team. And he said she chose stuff, and the stuff meant allegations of sexual harassment. She chose stuff that really breaks families down. And it had the most ghastly effect. But what it actually came down to, and this is where I'm putting this as part of she definitely had a mental health issue. She knew that she was not performing up to scratch. And her words to her boss were, I know I'm going down, but I'm taking you down with me. And these are some of the kind of toxic, hostile environments that really can create mental health issues, not only be the cause of, but yeah, can be the impact as well. Um, and I just want to make a point here. I have done many sexual harassment cases. In all the years I've been doing this, I've experienced two false allegations. So please don't hear me playing into a narrative of the narrative that this is a frequent occurrence. It hasn't been in my experience. Um, then the other one that I thought of are how it may present itself at the workplace, mental health issues, is a constructive dismissal. And there is quite a famous case that I think ended up at the Labour Appeal Court. I'm not going to go into mentioning that here, but typically a person would resign due to, if they have a mental health issue, due to feel not being supported, and then they would say, this workplace is very hostile, and then kind of perhaps not get then think that they can resign and claim that their situation was intolerable. But we know that even some of the more robust lawyers would say, oh, be careful there, because of course the burden of proof shifts to the employee to prove on a balance of probability about the intolerability. So this one isn't seen too often, but I can see, and I would imagine that a lot of people with mental health issues choose to resign and not to claim a constructive dismissal. So I think that a lot of people who leave a workforce with a mental health issue don't in fact make it through the process of going to lawyers and claiming a constructive dismissal or taking any other action. I think sometimes, sadly, these people just disappear. Um, and then the last one that I thought of, and of course by its very nature, no list is exhaustive, but the one that I've done quite a lot of work in is post-traumatic stress debriefing. Okay, and I just wanted to tell you, and this is probably the most dramatic thing which I'm going to bring up. But I have done many post-trauma interventions after suicides of people. And some years ago, there was a young man who very regrettably shot himself in the company's garage, the underground parking. And I mean, that had a major effect on the whole organization. And there have been others, and very often their colleagues who got to know them well, were very friendly with these people who then chose to end their own lives. They had a lot of guilt, they had a lot of blame, they needed a lot of counseling, a lot of support, a lot of debriefing, talking, venting, how they were feeling, and they often took quite a long time to heal. Well, I mean, if ever one does heal from a thing like that, but kind of feel it to be okay. But the the worst case that I ever did was this. It was a very small organization. There were five people in it. Two of the two of the five employees came together one morning early, opened up as usual, and found their colleague hanging. He'd hung himself overnight, and they were shocked. I mean, they were shocked beyond. And then the other two, the owner and his brother, came as well, and they had to. It was just, you can imagine what a kind of a mess things were. And I went in, I went to see them. They all just left work that day. So I went to see them the next day. We did a whole intervention, both with them as a group and then with them individually. But the employee who'd hung himself, as a favor, was staying in the employer's um, back room at his home because he was saving up to get married. He had a partner and a young child. And a couple of days after I saw them, they said to themselves, gosh, we better just go into the back room at the owner of this company's house and see, how things are in that back room. How did he leave things? And to everybody's shock and horror, they found, in fact, that he had murdered his partner and rolled her up in a carpet. So the employer had to then deal with a whole set of other events that just took everybody by surprise. And I must say, and you would know as well as I do that very often um, current traumas will trigger the traumas in our past. And it did in a couple of the people in this very, very small team. And it really took them many, many months to feel okay. Some of them, two of them had to go for sort of long-term counseling. So really these things that happen at work can have a major effect on you, your relationships with your family, friends, etc. So yeah, quite tough work to do sometimes. Okay, Marion, how are we doing for time?
Angela, we're fine. We're kind of halfway through the hour.
Okay.
There haven't been any questions in the chat yet, so everyone's obviously just hanging on to your lips. So have it.
Okay. Well, just probably thanking the good Lord that they are not, or whoever they thank, that they don't face this work very often. Okay. Right. So I wanted to share with you something that happened to me a couple of years ago and how it worked out. So um, I've asked Craig to put in two books to put into the chat function. The one is dealing with mental health at the workplace, and the other one is dealing with bullying and harassment. The one that was edited had a number of us write chapters for this book dealing with mental health in South African workplaces. Um, Published by Knowledge, or both of them are published by Knowledge Resources. Anyway, I was phoned by one of their editors out of the blue a couple of years ago, about 2020 it was. She said to me, "We're writing this book on mental health. Would you please do a chapter on dealing with the stigma of mental health at the workplace?" And I said, "Absolutely not. That is not an area of my speciality at all. But I've got a chapter about the role of the workplace in causing or exacerbating mental health issues that I've been dying to write." And I just finished another chapter for an ER textbook, which I'd struggled with, and it was a nightmare. Whereas this chapter, I'd had it at the top of my mind, and just once I started writing, I could almost not stop writing because I just had so much material on some of the issues in workplaces that cause or exacerbate mental health issues. But the opposite is true, and I reflect on this in my chapter as well. That, and all of us have either experienced this ourselves or we've watched colleagues, friends at work, relatives at work, where workplace can do the exact opposite. It can be fantastic for people's growth, development. They find the right environment. They click with the boss. They click with colleagues. I've seen quite shy, seemingly, not that confident people absolutely blossom at the workplace, given the right set of circumstances, the right degree of challenge, good relationships at work. We all know that there's been lots of research, especially in America in the 80s and 90s. People were really interested in the role of work in terms of giving social support to employees. There's been some fascinating stuff. So please, I'm going to focus on the role of the more negative role of the workplace in causing mental health issues. But at the same time, I have to say that the opposite is true. Um, so, um, the first point that I would just want to make in this section is the workplace may have absolutely no role in causing or causing mental health issues at all. It might be something that's genetic. It can be another factor that brings it out. As I say, trauma outside the workplace, loss, divorce, all of that. So really, sometimes there is no interconnection between the person's work life and their mental health issues. It could be an exacerbation of a condition where somebody has low levels of anxiety, or they've just kind of functioned, and then something at work will trigger something and just make a condition that they had that was quite latent and maybe quite hidden actually come to the fore. Um, then let me get on to the causes of mental health issues. Now, the way that I did them in this chapter, were I to redo the chapter, I would change it slightly. But the things that I would like to discuss with you are four things. So we're going to talk about poor leadership. We're going to talk about sexual harassment. We're going to talk about discrimination. And in the book, I pay particular attention to racism because I've done a lot of work in that field over the years. And then lastly, I'm going to talk about bullying as a form of incompatibility. And all of these were examples that I had, and I always keep the files. When I interview teams in the work that I do, I keep notes, and I don't ever throw those notes away. So I had in my back room all these notes of people who had suffered from these four issues and what they had actually said, and really tried to make their examples come to life so that people could learn about, some of the difficulties which people face at the workplace. Now, the I go into two leaders that I met over my many, many decades of doing this work now, who really were, I would say, the worst leaders that I'd ever seen, who had done the most damage to their teams. I'm happy to say one was male and one was female, so there's no gender stereotyping here. But what both of these leaders did in quite a similar way, although one was a very small organization, one was a very large organization, was they just created the most hostile, toxic workplace. People were not allowed to meet together for fear that they were gossiping about the leader. One of the leaders, when new people joined his team, he never introduced them to other people. Set up unrealistic workloads. People didn't have the right resources to do the work that they had to catch up doing over the weekend. They were belittled by these two leaders. And the one had a favorite saying, because he'd come from the private sector and was now in the public sector, and kept telling his group of people who I met all of them, and I thought that they were competent professional people. He used to say to them, you'd never make it in the private sector. Oh no, you just, and I saw him, or I met the people. In fact, the one set of three interviews that I did was in a psychiatric hospital, because one was an inpatient, one was an outpatient, and one had just been both of those and knew the place well. So that's where we agreed to meet. But these were people in both the teams who had a lot of somaticization, if that's the right word, somaticized a lot of their psychological symptoms, backache, migraines, renal problems, etc., as well as depression, and just unbelievable. I mean, not every leader's perfect, but my goodness, these two really were the opposite extremes of good leadership, very, very poor leadership. Um, Right. The next one I've in the book said sexual harassment, but I'm guessing that if I wrote it, I think we published in 2021, would do harassment, but I focused on sexual harassment. And sexual harassment is one of these awful happenings, events like rape. We know that if a person chooses to sue the person or go to court, we know who's on trial. The victim's on trial. And this is the same with sexual harassment, where more attention is given to the victim's behavior than the perpetrator's behavior. And that sets up a whole psychological undermining of a person. Um, and the silencing, and I've met victims who were silenced and they were senior people. In one example, all of these women sat on their exco and they were, or the different excos, they were silenced. And you think these are people with agency who'd been silenced. So really, I cannot. And that second book that I asked Craig to put in the chat function is a brilliant book written by a real ER or HR specialist called Mabore Sitole. It's a very moving account of her experience of harassment and bullying in the workplace. And she describes all of these symptoms so well. And really, it is just a very, very moving account. And I would encourage you to get hold of Knowledge Resources and to see where you can get copies of that book. Then discrimination, as I said, I focused on racism, but it can be any form of gender, whatever grounds there are. But I'm thinking of things like overt, covert racism in the workplace, where very often the people say, "Am I reading this correctly?" It's a very not black or white experience, very gray experience. They're saying, "Am I reacting to something? Am I underreacting?" And it just, again, a crisis of self-confidence is very often at the heart of this. I'm thinking about gender discrimination. I'm thinking about homophobia, about all sorts of isms, whether it's ageism, whatever it is. But discrimination is really it's something that I've noticed people, as I said earlier on, become almost resigned to it and say, "Look, this is just how life is for me." And I've made a choice to stay on because I just have got a lot of dependence. So that can be very, very a very sad situation. And then the last one, the incompatibility one, I did a investigation with somebody else. We did a HRER investigation into a company where there was a recent appointment of a very, very competent senior professional. She really was very competent at her job, and she let you know that she was very competent at her job. But unfortunately, her way of dealing with not only her own team, but then they had a restructure and she got a second team, was again this bullying, the belittling, her instincts were just so antithetical to the culture, and the culture of that company was very proudly collaborative, valued its people, demonstrating trust and respect. She had, I mean, again, I met wonderful, senior, clever, competent people who just had a crisis of confidence because they were given such negative feedback. And then also, the old one, the sort of the old chestnut where the boss doesn't pull the person into a room and humiliate them, but does it in front of the rest of the team. And that just sets up again a very, very toxic environment. Okay. So my list of conundrums are also nowhere near a full list, but just some food for you to go away and think about. The issue of disclosure. If we if we do have an underlying condition, illness, mental or physical, do we disclose it? And I know that there would be a whole range of opinion from absolutely no to, of course, we do absolutely yes. So I'm not giving any answers here. I mean, normally people may disclose, or they would have to at some stage disclose that there was some kind of a condition that may, but the other people would say, you don't really need to, and they would go for my next point, which is, when we come to some of these more sensitive mental health issues, people say, well, does the employer really need a diagnosis? Do they need to know exactly what's going on? Or can you just give a prognosis? So some kind of a way forward, what time they might need off, time away from work, time getting treatment, outpatient, attending group sessions, whatever it might be. So these are some of the things that people worry about. And then I know the one case did go that went to the labor appeal court. There was a lot of talk amongst and disagreement amongst people about, should you deal with what was happening as an incapacity or misconduct? And certainly what we teach in conflict dynamics in all our training courses is that please err on the side of incapacity, because you don't want to start a disciplinary inquiry and then have to backtrack and reverse your way out of that. That doesn't do any good for the credibility of the company's disciplinary system. So, we would say err on the side at least of dealing with it as an incapacity until you get the advice that in fact this is indubitably, undoubtedly a misconduct. A case of misconduct. And then I just posed myself the question, because something happened a few years ago. I have an old client who's been in my life for years and years and years and years. And they are a relatively small, it can't be more than 100 people in their organization. And I get called in from time to time, normally to do with people who incompatibility or mental health issues or whatever. And one day I got a phone call from the HR person to say, Angela, let's just say Mr. Smith. Mr. Smith, who we always suspected had an alcohol problem, has driven to work and is parked in the company's parking lot and absolutely very, very drunk. What do we do? And I thought about it for a split second and I said, you know something? In this case, you call the family. And there are times I've found over the last many years working with a whole assortment of mental health issues. There are some times where, sorry, I went on ahead by mistake. There are times when the employer and the family can very helpfully play a constructive role together to assist the family member stroke employee. But there are some times where actually families have to take over. And it is often in the area of very, very severe cases of psychosis and addiction, etc., where the employer just says, I've done all I can. I will support as much as I can, but there is just nothing else. So I've really posed that as a question for all of us to think about. And I did this work for many years without a labor law, employment law understanding. And what employment law has given to me is the balancing of the fairness, fair labor practices, but also fairness and, fairness for the employer, and also each case on its own merits. So whose problem is it? I think we would have to say we need to look at that case by case by case. Marion, I'm just checking up my time.
Angela, we've got about a quarter of an hour left.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think there are some interesting questions that have been raised, but I suggest we deal with specifically the addiction aspect
Okay.
that we'll have to deal with, and then we can I can pose the questions.
Okay. Okay. So there are what I call well-known addictions and less known addictions. So let's just deal with the addictions that all of us know. If we haven't suffered from it ourselves, I hope not, certainly friends, family members, relatives, people we know in different spheres of our life, these are the ones that are the most common and that we think of. When you think of addiction, these pop into our head quite naturally. So this would be alcohol, drugs, legal, and over illegal, I should say, and over the counter, the codeine, the prescription drugs, the cough mixtures, the grandpa headache powders. There was a time, and the time I'm referring to was in about the mid 80s, where one of the most hidden problems was addiction to grandpa headache powders. And I was absolutely shocked to hear this. I worked for Anglo Alpha in those days, and we had a quarry and a very efficient occupational health practitioner. And she alerted me to, this well-known problem, it wasn't well known to me then, of people being addicted to grandpa headache powders. And I was fascinated because one saw them always hanging at the back of a cafe, but never gave them any thought. Anyway, at that quarry, I met a supervisor, and we were chatting, and he said to me, "No, no, he takes grandpa." So I said, "How many do you take a day?" He said, "Oh, very few, only 25." And I was like, "What? You take 25 grandpa headache powders?" So that really was yes, quite a shock to someone, even like myself, who'd kind of worked a little bit in the field by then. So these are the ones that we would, you know, eating disorders can also be a form of addiction. And but I just want to raise some ones that really would, I just hope, make you think about this a little bit more broadly about addiction. Gambling, we could almost put that in the first category. It is a well-known addiction, and I've had some shocking cases with gambling. Um, Addiction to work, being addicted to work. People who are addicted to work often get very far and they become very senior, and kind of, no one stumbles on the fact that people can be addicted to work. People can be addicted to exercise, to gym, to looking good. Um, I've met some people who tell me that their partners are addicted to golf and other sports, you know, um, power, politicians. A lot of politicians are addicted to power. I've spent quite a lot of time over the years with exiles overseas with their families and things like that, and their children tell you amazing stories about abandonment, with people who are very into politics, and it takes all their time and energy, weekends, etc., etc. And then the other one, and please, this is not any point about any religion, but I have also noticed the similar dynamics, because the common dynamics to all of this, people, those of us who have dealt with addicts in our lives, is abandonment and addiction to religion. can also be abandonment. And I became aware of this when I got to know, as a young adult, a friend whose parents were very, very, very staunchly religious, and there were three girls, and the fourth girl was a Down syndrome baby. And the three healthy kids often turned to their parents and said, "Please, won't you explain why Dory is like this?" And all the parents would ever say is, "It's God's will." And I listened to her, and sometimes the more wine she had, the more she spoke with some sadness and anger about her parents being so closed. So I took that as a form of abandonment. Okay. And for those of you who are saying, "Oh my goodness me, should I interrogate my husband or wife golfing and see if they're addicted?" Well, some rules of thumb about whether anything is an addiction. As someone said to me the other day, everybody's addicted to something, whether it's Coke Light or whether it's yogurt or whatever it is. Um, is anybody in your family and friendship circle complaining about whatever behavior it is? That's often a good, or has it interfered with relationships? And do you have withdrawal symptoms if you don't do or eat or drink or whatever it is? So those are just some really kind of, popular rules of thumb. Okay. Um, I'm coming to the end soon. The challenge of denial, we know a core component of any addiction is denial, because that protects the addiction. And it is a core component. And this is something that I'm going to give a little bit of guidance on. Dealing with abandonment. We know that children of addicts of any sort will suffer terribly from abandonment. And here we know that there's physical abandonment, but there's also emotional abandonment. And these two forms of abandonment we know lead to anger in terms of resentment and distrust, and hurt in terms of loneliness and sadness. And you ask any adult child of an alcoholic or addict of any sort, they will tell you a lot about these sorts of feelings. Um, and then what I say to everybody whenever we talk about addictions, excuse me, if you are ever have experts are often themselves recovering addicts. They are fantastic at doing constructive confrontation and not being manipulated by the addict. So addiction is, I'm afraid, a a challenge, and will remain a core challenge in terms of mental health issues. And the final point that I just wanted to make is, in thinking and dealing a lot, especially after training sessions that we do a lot of, and people asking questions, they often come to me with terrible examples and say, "How do we deal with this?" And often it's about mental health. And everyone who works in HR, ER related roles, I would strongly advise, even if it's not a formal network, an informal network of a mental health advisory group, people, psychologists, social work, clinical social workers, social workers in private practice, psychiatrists, your own medical, some people have in-house medical facilities, some large organizations, but really you need a group around you of people who you can turn to and say, "I need a sounding board. I need to tell you what's going on. Can you lead me or refer me to some people who'll be able to give us a perspective about what do we do, whose problem is this, and how do we handle it. Okay, Marion, I hope I haven't gone over time and maybe there are a few minutes left.
There are a few minutes left, Angela. So one of the really interesting questions that were raised in the chat is about the line between support and overreach. So, as an employer, there needs, what is the line between supporting someone who has mental health issues and overreaching in terms of that support?
Okay. Marion, at the end of the day, the bottom line is whatever we are contracted to do, if we can't fulfill those contractual obligations, and there is some, you know, need for accommodation. But at the end of the day, and there are some tragic cases of physical cancer, horrible road accidents, etc., etc. If we can't fulfill our role, then the employer can't keep a position open for us. And there are times when there just has to be a parting of the ways. But again, each case on its merit. I think to make a blanket rule for every case, all cases of XYZ will be dealt with in this particular way. But it's a good question, and it's a good question to ponder on.
I mean, there was another example of someone who explains a scenario in their workplace where someone is suspected to have bipolar disorder, and when that person is on a high, then the environment is constructive and engaged and productive. But when that person who is the manager is on a low in terms of the bipolarity, then the environment is really toxic. And, what does one do in a situation like that? I mean, I guess the question
Marion,
that there has actually been a diagnosis. But sorry, just to...
No. Bipolar is, we know, a mood disorder. Unfortunately, there's quite a strong link between bipolar, especially the mania side of it, and a link with addiction as well, which can make it a very difficult thing to handle. And I've personally, especially the last one I did, which was some years ago, had very bad experiences with people who had bipolar diagnoses. But in fact, I always suspected that there was an addiction problem somewhere, but the employer tried everything, and then there was quite a lot of manipulation, and oh boy, it just got so complicated till the employer just said, "That's it, we can't do this anymore. This is becoming." Unrealistic. So unfortunately, bipolar is, but a fair amount of people who go onto the right medication do well. And it does seem to kind of balance things a bit, but bipolar can be a challenge to deal with.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for that. The other question that was raised, which is a good way to kind of wrap up the conversation, I guess, is just a question of as to whether all workplaces have to have a qualified mental wellness expert, and what that expert looks like in terms of qualifications and certifications, because some people may be offering advice and guidance when they're not really qualified to do so, to employees who are battling with mental wellness issues. So I guess the question is really, what is the most effective and credible route to ensure proper mental wellness support in the workplace?
In the 80s, it was scarce to find a wellness program. Now, every single employer seems to have a mental a wellness program, and I am often shocked that the HR people haven't ever thought about using the excellent a group of psychologists or clinical social workers or whoever they've got, other mental health practitioners who are accredited, otherwise they wouldn't be working in those wellness programs, that they don't use them more. And I don't mean going to see them about their own mental health problems. Of course, we can do that as well. But I mean going to them to get advice and guidance about, I don't know what to do with this particular employee. Won't you lend a perspective? Won't you help me think through? Do you know any good resources? Do you know any self-help groups for this particular mental health issue? So,
Great. So
use your wellness program. And if you don't have one, just find out which ones are highly recommended, and then make as part of your advisory, mental health advisory group, just have a couple of people to hand that you can just phone or consult with or send somebody to see, something like that. Because it can get very it's a very heavy thing to carry on one's own, not knowing what to do. So just get as much support and guidance as you can.
thank you, Angela. Yes, I mean, there are some fascinating issues that are coming up in the chat now. And maybe as we wrap up, Angela can take a look at a couple of those and maybe just respond to them. So stay on the system for a little longer. But we really do not have time to go into all of them. This is something that every workplace is challenged by. And I think, Angela, your advice to really just get a support group if you're responsible within your company, or if you're a manager, get a support group, or if you're in ER or HR, make sure you have support systems and advisory systems that can assist you to really. What I've come away with this conversation is it's quite a tight rope of being supportive and assisting people and keeping the interests of the workplace in mind, because the workplace at the end of the day has to be productive in order to be able to sustain employment and these programs. So it is a balancing act. Thank you very,
Yes.
very much, Angela, and thank you to everyone who joined us this afternoon. It's been fascinating to me, and certainly your questions indicate that you're grappling with some really challenging aspects. Hopefully we can pick up this conversation some other time, or maybe in a different format even. Have a good afternoon
Great.
further. Thank you.
Thanks very much, everyone.